When I started Marketing Sweat so many years ago, one of the commitments that I made to myself was that if I reached 100 episodes, I would invite Jim Simantel back to the agency and ask him to tell us the story of this amazing company. So we're sitting here today and we are about to welcome the founder of Simantel to join Chris Main and I and tell you the story about this amazing place. Chris, as our longest standing employee, has quite a bit of stories to share, and I just cannot wait to get into this episode. Well, we are here with Jim Simantel, the founder of our company, somebody that I have wanted to meet my whole entire life. Thank you for coming all the way from Florida to be back in this place we call home. Welcome. I'm glad you're here.
Thank you.
Yeah, I can't tell you how much this means to me, Jim. We've been working on this for a couple of years now, so this is a big day for us.
Right.
And I can't tell you, how important it is to all these people. We've got almost 160 people here now, and they all know who you are. Because when they get onboarded, the first question they ask is, where did the name Simantel come from?
Yeah,
And so we've got an onboarding video that talks about you and how you started the company, and hopefully we'll be able to get into a little bit of that today. We want to hear it from your perspective.
Yesterday, you came into the office and for the first time got a tour of this place that you called home for so long. So fill us in on the just first impressions.
Culture shock. Basically, this company is 3 generations away from when I started. And to see just the number of people kind of blew me away. And the changes that have been made architecturally. I'm a frustrated architect. I wanted to be an architect from when I was a kid, and didn't have the math aptitude for it. So, I just love creating spaces for creatives.
Right.
And I think that's important. That's something that I learned from you and have tried to carry forward, from the times that, from even the building when I started up on Main Street and came to interview with you the first time. I remember walking up that long staircase in front. And before that, I had been in interviews in Chicago and St. Louis, and I walked into your office on Main Street and was blown away. Like, this is cooler than any of the offices.
That was a neat space.
Yeah.
Being a creative, and that's all I am. I'm just a graphic designer who was fortunate enough to build a company.
Yeah.
But what was always important to me was the aesthetics of the environment that you're asked to create all of these wonderful things in. And so that's why it was always been important to me, from where I live, my house, my home, my cars, everything is done aesthetically.
Yeah.
It's just my bone.
So let's start at the beginning. So tell me your story. Where'd you grow up? And like you said, you had interest even as a little boy to do architecture. So what were you who were you uniquely passionate about?
I grew up in a big family. My mom had 6 sons, no daughters. Iron woman. She was wonderful. In Naperville, Illinois. My father died when my mom was 6 months pregnant with me. He drowned in a fishing accident. He was out fishing with 3 friends, none of them which were swimmers. And a storm came up, tipped the boat over, and he saved all 3 of them and drowned.
Mm.
So he did save their lives. But I never knew my real father, and he was quite a guy. He was creative as well. He's a builder. And I suppose that's where I get it from. But I'm 10 years younger than my youngest brother. They're all 10 years older than me. And I have 2 stepbrothers. My mom raised the 4 boys herself for 3 years until I was 3 years old. And then she got remarried to a guy who had 2 sons. So that made 6 boys.
I bet all those experiences informed a lot of your thinking growing up in terms of who you needed to be in the world.
It really did. Again, my brothers were quite a bit older than I was. So the next oldest brother to me was my mentor and my idol my whole life. He was a hard worker. He was, again, creative. He ended up being the senior vice president of International Harvester. Muhammad Ali was one of his best friends. He was just a fascinating guy. And he's the one that was really a stimulant for me to work hard
It's so cool.
because he just worked like crazy.
Yeah.
So
So
that's
you were
what-
the baby, is that right?
I was the baby. I'm the baby.
Do you have a lot of baby birth order tendencies? Were you the spunky one, and did you act out a lot as a kid?
I am the spunky one. Yeah, that's for sure. I was a challenge to my mom. Yeah, that's for sure.
I love it. So you grew up in Naperville, and then you ended up in the big city of Chicago. I
Well,
understand.
Chris was talking about when he got stimulated creatively. Well, it was sixth grade for me. That's when I got into the business. And, I was living at home with my family, and I was in sixth grade, and I was I was always drawing something, and ended up entering a national design contest where the criteria for what you had to create had to be a poster for Hire the Handicap. Well, I won this national contest. I won $500. Now you have to realize I'm almost 80 years old. $500 back in my sixth grade put me through college. So it was pretty cool. That was pretty cool. So I won that. That's what really got me into the business. And I was always that kid through high school that they asked to design the floats for homecoming, the sets for prom, things like that, So I was always involved in that. I was always interested in that end of the creative.
What kinds of things inspired you?
I think just life in general inspired me, and people. I love the interaction that you get from people. It forms your opinions about what they're going to expect of you as well. So
Absolutely.
yeah.
I wonder if you could maybe, now you're talking about getting into high school, tell us about college. I mean, was that when you got the passion, and did you get into design then, or was
did.
that later?
I knew when I went to college that I wanted to do something creatively. So I originally went to Southern Illinois University. A friend of mine, and this is a little backstory behind this, I wasn't going to go to college. I was going to be a mechanic. And my best friend was going to Southern. My two best friends were going to Southern. And they convinced me to just try it for a semester, come down to Southern. Well, Southern was the party school in this country back in those days, back in 1964, So I said, okay, I'll come down and party with you for a summer. I love college. I struggled all the way through high school, and in college, I never got less than an A. I just aced everything all the way through college. I don't know why, but I did. That's where I found some direction. I went to SIU's Vocational Technical Institute. I wanted to be an airbrush artist because back then, all the artists were using airbrushes. There was no computers back in those days. I didn't take a horse and buggy to class. I'm not that old, but so I figured I'd go to VTI. I tried that. I went out, learned how to use an airbrush, became a technical illustrator, and actually I got my first degree in visual communications and technical illustration. So I graduated from Southern. My wife had come down my junior year at Southern.
Yeah.
And we met across a parking lot from each other, actually. She went to VTI as well. And I got off the bus and I saw her coming across the parking lot, and we both stopped. We were probably 60 feet apart. Both stopped and we looked at each other, and then she turned and went her way and I went the other way. And it wasn't until 3 weeks later that I actually met her. So that's where we met, at Southern.
That's fascinating that you remember that moment.
Yeah.
of seeing her.
Absolutely.
So what brought you back together 3 weeks later?
A friend of hers was dating my roommate at the time, and they introduced us. So that's how we got back together.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great story.
I had two opportunities when I graduated from Southern. I could go to, or I was offered a job from McDonnell Douglas, which is an aircraft outfit out of St. Louis, or Bell Labs, both of which needed airbrush artists, technical artists. And I selected Bell Labs because it was home for me. It was comfortable. Then I got married while I was at Bell Labs. I was there for about 5 years. Really got bored. Technical illustration, once you learn how to render a screw or a part and you do it over and over and over, it just gets boring, and I got bored. One of my friends that was also an illustrator there thought he was a lot more than he was. And he approached me and said, Jim, let's open up an agency and we'll just both get rich. And I said, so Bob, do you know anything about graphic design? Oh, no, but we're both so creative, we can handle that. And I said, well, okay. I went and talked to Lynn, and Lynn said, you don't know anything about graphic design, you're an illustrator. So she actually convinced me to go back to college and get a degree in graphic design. So I went to what was then called the Chicago Academy of Fine Arts. It was right downtown Chicago. I mean, here I'm a young guy in Chicago, man, the creative environment. It was a school that was run by, or the design part of that school was run by a guy named Bob Mulcahy. Now, Bob has got quite a reputation. He was an internationally renowned designer. He wasn't an educator. He was a working graphic designer with a very successful business. He actually designed the entire signage program for the National Zoo in Washington, D.C. That's where he made his reputation. But he was my first mentor. And he's the one that said, if you ever get into the design business, you have to realize that design is not a job. It's an entire lifestyle. And everything you do and think about during the day all relates back to something you may practice for one of your clients. And of course, I'm a lover of architecture, and he was a Frank Lloyd Wright freak. He's the one that made me a Frank Lloyd Wright freak. And in Oak Park, there's a lot of Frank Lloyd Wright houses. There's about a dozen of them. And he got us tours to those houses. He'd also have his favorite people. He had about 5 of us that were his favorites. I was the favorite because I was the oldest. They called me Dad, because they were all just starting college. I had already finished one degree. I'm back again. I was married, starting another one. So I was the old guy, but Bob and I got along great. And like I say, he was my mentor. He used to have us 5 young, creative people come to his house on the weekends, and we just sit around and bullshit about design, about creativity, about architecture, about anything that he could think of. We just talk about it. And that probably stimulated me to get into this business more than anything. Bob was a brilliant, brilliant man.
One of the things that strikes me even so far in our conversation is how this idea that inspiration and creativity comes from everywhere, right? You said,
Yeah.
So, and that was actually one of the sort of philosophies that was taught to me coming up in this business. You can be driving down the street and see something and then have $1 million idea, right?
Exactly right. You're exactly right. And that's what I try to teach him when he was a puppy,
Well, I want you to know those lessons got passed on even to me. So that's awesome.
That's good. That's a good thing. When I was at Chicago Academy, my wife worked for a company called the Lansing Corporation, and they were a recreational land developer. And again, I was full-time college, but she convinced them that I was this highfalutin graphic designer and that I could do all the promotion for their recreational land developments. Well, she was wrong, but anyway, I got into doing some of these things, and they were the worst crap you ever saw, and these people loved it. They just loved it. And of course, I became much more in love with design because I couldn't do it very well, and I was learning how to do it well.
Sure.
And they had some extremely successful programs and wonderful people. They talk about people that were driven. This guy would call meetings at 2:00 in the morning and expect us all to be there in 20 minutes. He was just a brilliant guy, and he's the one who concepted and developed this whole recreational land development concept where they'd buy a beautiful piece of property, and they develop it into recreational developments, housing and things like that as well. Fun stuff. So all of the people who graduated from Chicago Academy all had jobs before they graduated. We were all committed. And the one that I took was because two of my friends also went there, was a company called American Graphics Corporation. No longer exists, but it was a huge agency, 150 people. Now, does that sound familiar? And of course, me being a young graphic designer, I was hired as an art director. So it's the first time in my life I had a title. It was awesome. Got on there, went to work, got some great projects, started turning some stuff out. They had American Airlines as one of their main clients. So I got to do a lot of editorial design for that magazine. Really fun stuff, working with some senior people. They taught me how to do editorial design, which is a whole art in itself. They had a client, Kentucky Fried Chicken. Now that's when Kentucky Fried Chicken first started. And I got to design the first bucket. Now we're talking big stuff, man.
Mm-hmm.
This is the chicken bucket.
Exactly.
The very first one was designed by me, so I was kind of proud of that.
I never heard that story.
Yeah, well, you never heard a lot of these stories, Chris. Settle back.
All right.
They had a number of other big clients, but anyway, I was there for about 7 months, and all of a sudden they came to me and said, "Jim, we won't need you anymore." Oh, I was devastated. First time I'd ever been laid off. 60% of the whole company was laid off in one day. They lost American Airlines. They lost 2 other major accounts. So they just cut the staff by 60%. So I was out of work for about an hour and a half. Bob Mulcahy, my first mentor, the guy, he was great friends with a guy named Henry Roberts. Had a company called Henry Roberts Design. Right downtown in the Loop, was in the engineering building overlooking the river. He calls me and he said, "I'd like you to go to work for me as a graphic designer." And I just started to spot my pants. This is Henry Roberts. This is an internationally renowned graphic designer. And the head of American Graphics Design Department knew this guy very well. So they had called him and said, "Jim's out of work. Here's a young little designer that's got more energy than you can ever imagine." So he hired me. I went to work for Henry. Very strange guy, long gray hair, the typical kind of graphic designer. In the winter, he'd wear ankle-length coats, trench coats, black, always black trench coats. And he would spend most of the day standing by the window, looking out the window. Somehow that got him stimulated, got him inspired. Well, he had some awesome accounts. 3-man agency. He had himself, 2 other designers, and he hired me. I was the 3rd. Little bitty shop. And his wife. His wife worked there, and her name was Zelda. She would look at you all day long, make sure you were working, Wouldn't let you go to the bathroom. But, it was what it was. I was exposed to, at that point, McDonald's. He did McDonald's annual report for about the last 4 years. Now, back in those days, designing annual reports was the epitome for a graphic designer. Companies don't spend that money anymore. They just don't do it. But, these were some of the most beautiful print pieces you've ever seen. And they were always experimental. When new varnishes came out, we used them for the parts, They had Chicago Bridge and Iron, Zenith Corporation, the TV company, and my favorite, not my favorite, but one of the ones I really enjoyed was Jovan Cosmetics. If you've heard of Jovan Cosmetics, I designed the original packaging for their musk oil and their civet oil. And the men's perfume is still on the market in the same damn box I designed.
Wow.
That's kind of crazy,
That's cool.
But a story that I have to tell you about McDonald's. I was working on the cover for their annual report, and I was working closely with Henry, and he was giving me his thoughts about they would always tell us what their mission was for the year, and this report should summarize what that mission is. So I spent a couple of weeks turning out covers, and there were 3 that I produced that Henry really liked and felt comfortable about. And he said, Jim, you're going to go present these to Ray Kroc. Now, you've heard of Ray Kroc. He started McDonald's, as a malt shop originally. Ray was an intimidating guy. Nice guy, but intimidating. He says, you're going to go out there by yourself without me. He says, you created these. You should be able to present them to the client. Well, where did I get that from?
Yeah.
Well, I went, and I've never been so nervous in my life to go into Oak Brook, which is where their corporate offices are, up on the top floor, up to Ray Kroc's office, and sit there waiting to see him with my big portfolio under my arm, and these 3 concepts. And I'm repeating, what am I going to say to Ray Kroc for my concepts, Went in there, nice guy, shook my hand. We sat down. He's an older fella. And so I started presenting them. And the way I presented was I always present the weakest concept first, and you close with the biggie,
Sure.
You work your way up. And so I presented the first one, and he just looks at me and he says, it ain't going to work. Oh, my God, I was nervous. Pulled out the second one, which was a little more direct toward what he was thinking, Presented that. Took me 15 minutes to go through the concepts on why I did it. And he said, well, you're getting there. He says, but that's not what I'm after. And so I presented the third one. I figure, man, if this thing nosedives, I'm going to lose my job. Henry's going to throw me out, and put out a contract on me. And so I went through the whole concept just like that. He stood up in his chair, and I thought I was going to pass out. And he reached over the conference table and shook my hand. He says, that sucker's beautiful. I love it. And he just turned around and walked over.
That's amazing.
And that's the one they used.
I love it.
Great story.
Yeah.
But that sort of got me into the mindset that designers have to be exposed directly to the client. Henry knew that.
Sure.
So I did that ever since, when we got the shop big enough to have a few designers like Chris, I made sure that he was the one presented his concepts. I didn't do it. I didn't have to do it. He knew it better than I did.
We just presented Jim to a client a couple weeks ago, and that's one of the things CMO, of this major corporation says to us, you let your creatives present like strategy people, and we're that's what makes us different.
It's unique. Yeah, it really is unique.
Well, the other thing before you go on that I hear in your story is this sort of fearlessness that you were taught at a young age. And I think that's another value that we have baked into our teams. I have a story where I went to a very high level meeting at the age of 22, and I came back and my boss was like, why did you do that? But you learn in those moments that you have to sort of fake it till you make it.
Exactly.
And you learned that at a young age.
Yeah. It takes balls to start a business. It really does. When I started this business, I had 2 little babies at home. I had one that was 3 and one that was 1. I left a nice house in Naperville that my wife and I had bought when I worked for Bell Laboratories. Took this money to Peoria, and I knew I was going to knock this town dead. I loved Henry, and I loved the work that I was doing. It was incredible, and I was learning so much. He turned me into a sophisticated graphic designer, one that thinks and just doesn't design. I got an offer from a friend who worked at Bell Labs. Now, this was when deregulation happened in the telecommunications business, when AT&T was split up, and there were a bunch of spin-offs from that company, one of which was Westcom, a company called Westcom. They were also a telecommunications company, and they needed a lot of collateral material developed for their new company to introduce it to the world. Very rich guys. And so they made me an offer I couldn't refuse. It didn't work out. It was a corporate environment, and I am not a corporate. I'm about as far from a corporate guy as you can possibly get. I worked there for 2 years. The politics drove me nuts, And that's when I said, and of course my ego was big enough at that point. Well, I said, I'm going to go to Peoria and move my family down there. My in-laws lived there. I loved this town. I loved the river, and I'm an outdoorsman. So I said, I'm going to open up an agency, and I'm just going to blow this town apart. Well, wrong. I starved. The first year was really rough. I put together a mailer before I left Chicago that I was going to send to not only all the companies that I knew in this area, including Caterpillar. There were a number of other ones. And it was an awesome mailer. This thing was Chicago all the way. I sent this thing out, and I started getting calls from Jack Kinney at the printer. Now, this is back in the days when they used to set type, and we'd have to spec galley. I taught you how to spec galleys for every brochure that we did. You had to learn all that stuff. That's the way it was done back then. And a number of a typesetter, Pete Gorman, a number of other people, suppliers in the area. Well, all of a sudden my phone started to ring. They started coming over to my office. They said, I've never seen a brochure like this in this area. I've never seen anything like this. But anyway, these guys were coming over, and I was starting to make really good contacts with vendors. Didn't have any work, but someday it was going to come, and I'd be able to have vendors to do it, you know. I got a call from Caterpillar. They had gotten the brochure. Keith Schofield got this brochure. And he says, I need to see you right away. I wet my pants. I was a one-man shop. I was there all by myself. My wife was with me. It was just the two of us. She was taking care of the babies, and I'd work all day. And Keith called me. I go over there, and here's this big lobby. You know, this is down at GO. I was asked to GO. Keith came down and introduced himself, took me upstairs. It took me about a half hour to get back to where his space was. And we went into the conference room with another guy, and I can't remember who it was. And he says, this is really nice stuff. And he had the brochure out there. You know, it was a 3-gatefold. He says, it's really nice stuff. He says, Jim, we can't give you any work. He says, Cat is so big and there's so much work that we'd bury you and you'd be out of business in the first week. He said, and this was over an hour's conversation. He said, when you get big enough, when you get some people that you can handle some work, come back and talk to me. Well, like I said, I starved that year. We used up most of the money we had made on our house. And I was getting close to moving the family right back to Chicago, where I knew the environment. And ran into a guy who had a small agency up in the Heights. The guy's name was Gary Cayley. He had some really nice accounts. He says, I can't come in here and create anymore, you know. I like doing the client work, but I need somebody who can really crank out good design, you know. And he says, I saw your brochure. I had to give you a call. And, you know, this brochure just got me a lot of places. But anyway, Lynn and I talked about it, and I said, you know, why don't I go into business with this guy? And, you know, he can do the account work, and he's got the clients, and I'll do the design, you know.
And you guys were Cayley then, or was that after?
Haley Seamantle.
Kaylee Seamantle.
Right.
How do you say Seamantle?
It's Seamantle. I mean, if you look at the roots, it's Seemandel. It's 100% German. And when my grandfather came over here, he changed it from Seemandel to Seamantle. And there are a couple of hundred Seamantles in Oklahoma. None of them are left here. My brothers are gone.
That's interesting.
Cayley was the nicest guy, a religious fanatic. I mean, a fanatic. He would leave at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, go to church, you know, and then go back home. Gary would come in at 9, and he'd leave at 4 with a 2-hour lunch. And I'm working 16, 18, sometimes all-nighters, turning out great stuff for L.R. Nelson and client. He had some great clients. But man, that gets old when he's, you know, coasting along, skating, making all the money, making half of it. Well, making half plus $1. So I really got tired of it. So I said to Gary, I said, this really isn't working out. So legally, we had to split the company in half. Plus he had 1%. So he took all the furniture, all the drawing boards, all the equipment, the stat machines, the cameras, and I took all the clients.
Good for you.
Man, that made me smile. Now, we didn't get them all. We didn't get Crow, but we did get some Nelson work and some of the other clients that we worked with, enough to get us started. The agency was growing like crazy. We had, I think there were 8 of us, something like that. But the work was coming in like crazy. Everything stopped. My best friend was senior vice president for Bergner's. When Bergner's was sold, they moved it up to Milwaukee. And my best friend was a senior vice president for Bergner's. And so they moved him up to Milwaukee. And Lynn and I went up there for a weekend just to visit them. We love these people. And boy, I had a stomach ache. Driving up there from Peoria to Milwaukee, and it kept getting worse and kept getting worse. And I told Lynn, man, my guts are killing me. Got up there, greeted them, had a couple of drinks, and, we're going to go out to dinner. I said, damn, I don't know if I'm going to be able to do this. I'm in such pain. So I went in and lay down for a while, couldn't do anything. I mean, the pain was absolutely excruciating, to a point where we ended up calling back down to Peoria to find out from my doctor, to find out what we were supposed to do. That was back in the old days when you could talk to the doctor. He says, well, it sounds like it could be kind of serious. You might have a bowel blockage or something that we need to get out of there, or you could be in trouble. Do you think you can drive your 5 hours back home? I made it through the night. Somehow I made it through the night. Never slept a bit. There was so much pain. Lynn drove me home. We got back home. We went directly to the hospital. I was diagnosed with a large pancreatic carcinoma and given 6 weeks to live. Hello. So Doc says, you got to say goodbye to your 2 daughters because you're going to be out of here. It's big. And he says, we've got an option. You can have what's called a Whipple procedure, which is one of the largest abdominal surgeries that you can have. And he says, we might be able to give you 6 months to a year if you have this Whipple done. I said, hell yeah. If I can get a year with my girls and at least get the agency figured out on what the heck we're going to do with that. So we opted for the surgery. It was about a 16-hour surgery. It was done in 3 shifts. But halfway through, my gastroenterologist, who became a good friend of mine, obviously, observed the surgery. He was in the surgery the whole time. And the waiting room was full of people. It had most of my clients were there. All the staff was there. My relatives. I mean, there were 40 people in this waiting room, probably. Lynn is in there waiting for the gastroenterologist comes into the room. And he stands there and he says, the tumor was benign. But by that time, they were 8 hours into the surgery. They had to complete it. It's a big surgery. So it took me, I was in the hospital, and Lynn could tell you better than this, probably 3 months that I was away from the agency. When I was well enough in the hospital, Susie would bring me up layouts and Barb would come, and there was always somebody there during the day that would be bringing me things to get approvals on. My wife went into the office every day. She was there every day that I was out.
Well, what an amazing story, Jim. I think in this business, because it is so fast-paced and so intense, that sometimes we lose sight of those life or death moments, right? This is advertising. That's real, right? Your family. And so this business, it's so personal because of the relationships that you make. And so just say a little bit more about how that moment in your life where you literally was, facing life or death, how it put things into perspective and how maybe it changed you going forward from there?
Wow, that's a good question. I should have given me time to prepare for that one. I think it made me more emotionally involved in every decision that I made. It wasn't just a business anymore, because I could have left it so quickly. But that's what changed, I think, as I looked more at my people and what they would have done without me there. And sure, they would have survived. They would have gotten other jobs and, whatever. But that's when I first really realized that I have, whether it was 6 or 8 people working for me at the time, their livelihood depends on every decision that I make. And every decision I make impacts them. And I never really stopped to look at the business that way before I was sick. That made a huge difference in the way that I approached my employees, my clients, vendors. I think that's when it became more emotional for me. I came back in 3 months, and we had outgrown that space. We were bursting at the seams. And you had come on at that time, I think, when we were...
It was just after that.
Just after
when
that.
you guys moved to Main Street.
So you're up on Main Street. When do you transition to Water Street or...
So we were busting at the seams, literally working butt to butt. We moved in there with 12 people, you said?
Yeah.
We got it up to about 30 in the same amount of space. And it was getting uncomfortable for everyone. You didn't have room to spread out. We're jamming desks in between desks, and it was getting uncomfortable. So I was out walking at lunchtime one day, and I saw this old building set back. And actually, I've got a picture in my phone of that building when I first saw it. And I said, wow, that's just a big old empty warehouse. Something like that would work for us. It was ugly as hell. And I knew Dan Phillips, who owned the Antique Center next door. And I said, Dan, is that old building between the Antique Center and the Meatpacking Company, is that your building? He says, yeah. He said, I'm going to tear that sucker down, make a parking lot out of it. I said, well, do me a favor, will you? Let me in it. Give me the key and just let me roam around in there before you knock it down. He did. I took a big flashlight with me, and I can't remember whether I took you down there once.
No, I think that you did all this on your own. We heard about it afterwards.
Okay. Well, I went through and I saw these great big beams, and of course it was filthy in there. It was an old, I think it was a furnace factory the last time that anybody had occupied it. Ironically, our Main Street office was built in 1881. That building was built in 1881. Bizarre. Both buildings were built the same year. Anyway, I talked to Dan. I said, it'd be a shame. I want to make a magnificent design office, an agency out of that building. So when I'm going through this with the spotlight going through the building here at Water Street, I see this bunch of wood standing up against the wall. And there were 3 sections, I think. Heavier than hell. I tried to tip them back and it was dark in there. I tried to tip them back. Well, heck, they weighed probably 400 pounds apiece. And I tipped them back far enough to where I could see that there was a red painting of a part of a circle on there. And I figured, what could those be? So I went to Dan and I said, Dan, you got some old lumber laying up against it. He said, that's not old lumber. That's the center court on Bradley basketball floor in the old field house, the original floor. I said, I'll tell you what. I'll buy those sections of floor if you throw the old building in. And he laughed and he says, well, I think we got a deal. So I ended up with 3 sections of that original field house floor. Nobody knew they were being stored in there. They had been in there for 20 years, for Christ's sake. And so then I started getting, I knew we were going to make conference tables out of them from day one, as soon as I saw them. So it took us between 4 and 6 months to rebuild. We had the drawings done and everything. Went for final zoning on this riverfront building. The city says, well, code says you got to raise that floor 4 feet. We had to raise the level of that floor by 4 feet. Wasn't in the budget. I had this thing budgeted down to the last penny I had in my pocket, you know. I put everything into that building. And then they said, you got to raise it. Well, I met a banker called Steve Daggs up at Jefferson Bank, and that's where I went for my mortgage on that thing. And Steve Daggs met with me, and I said, you know, I sort of spread out what the company had done over the last year and how we're growing and who our clients were and things like that. He said, how much do you need? And I told him. He says, when do you want the check? So Steve was really instrumental in getting his business going. He was a great guy. He's retired now, but so he gave me the money. So we just started building this thing. And
I mean, that to me is a big risk. How did you know you were going to be able to pay it off?
I didn't. But I knew that we would. No problem. It never crossed my mind that I wouldn't be successful at anything I did.
Well, you also talked about so many different types of design. So you talked about package design and editorial design and annual reports. Was there something you fell in love with, or did you love the variety of it?
Oh my God, I loved it all. You know, anything creative. It was so much, this business is so fun. And I'm just a little designer. That's all I know. I'm a creative guy, you know. I'm one of the guys that you put back in the corner because you don't want to show them to your clients because they got this long hair and they dress funky and, you know, back in those days.
Well, you said you love all of it, all the kinds of design.
Oh my God. Packaging was something that I got introduced to my second time when Bob Mulcahy was a teacher. We had the men had to, one of our projects that I remember, the men had to design a perfume container for women, and the girls had to design packaging for a jockstrap. Now, what does that say? It means you got to go out and research the opposite sex, what turns them on, why they wear those underwear, you know. And the guys have to go out and say, well, what are you trying to do with that cologne? Are you trying to excite the males in your life? You know, what are you trying to do with it? So it was a research project more than a design project.
I love that.
That's what teaches you how to think,
Yes.
you know, how to make really good decisions when it comes to design.
I think to that point, I think that was what you were so good at when you came to Peoria, is hiring people that could think that way.
Smart
They
people.
weren't just a designer sitting in the back corner. There's somebody that could go out, meet with the client, understand where they're coming from, what their goals are, who's the audience that we're trying to reach.
You know, and it goes two ways. The clients really appreciated when I would bring Chris into a meeting with him, because they knew that ultimately I had everything to say about what was actually presented to the client. But here I'm bringing one of my creatives into a executive board meeting with 6 department heads at Caterpillar.
Was there a point in your career where you stopped designing and started managing? Or did you?
That's a day I try to forget.
Well, I just wonder, because
was
all
hard.
of us have to leave our craft at some level, or did you make sure that you sort of kept your hands busy?
That happened over time. And it was because I was forced to, for a couple of reasons. One, because the agency was growing so fast. And number two, I had some great young designers that were doing some great stuff. And it was at a point where, from a relationship standpoint, they would share their ideas with me, I think, as just because they had to, because my name was on the door. But they were doing fabulous work. And because the agency was growing, somebody had to do the managing. And we weren't at a point where I could hire a manager. So I got to still take my kind of key projects, and I'd toss the rest of them at Chris and Susie, and the very talented young people that I had with me. And I didn't want to take the work away from them because they were there to do it. So I gave it to them.
Did you like being a creative director in that process?
I did, yeah. You know, my wife always said you should have been a teacher, but I never wanted to teach. I wanted to do. And it was so fun to help educate these, because all the kids were young. They were all young people.
Yeah, and I think that's true. I mean, I still remember a couple of key pieces that I worked on, like early on, like right when I came in. One was that I think it was the 10th anniversary for Elevated Sprocket, and we went over and shot, a big photo shoot in East Peoria.
Yeah.
And I got to do the brochure for it. Just remember you helping me lay out that cover, and just the kind of the way you went about it was eye-opening for me. And I remember working on an insurance company billboard one time, and we had
Is that Illinois
photos.
Mutual?
No, it wasn't Illinois Mutual, and I can't remember the name of it. We didn't work for them for very long. It was American something, and we had a very, like maybe a row of slides that we could pick from a photo standpoint.
Slides?
Yes, yeah. Yeah,
Wow,
and so I did what I thought that I could with what I had, and I remember going in and showing you, and you were like, "Oh, come on, we got to do better than this," and you were able to take it to another level that I hadn't even thought about. But the photo was shot in a way where you barely saw the cliff. There was a guy, he was rock climbing on a cliff, and he was like hanging kind of on it, and so it was very much a sliver on the end of the billboard. The rest of it was just sky, and it just didn't look great, but it was the best I could do with what we had. And I remember you taking the layout, cutting that photo out, sliding it over, and you got your airbrush out, and you started building in the rest of the cliff. And so that taught me a lot, that you don't have to settle for what you're given. You got to think beyond that and make it more than that. And of course, nowadays it's so much easier to do that, to add sky, to add, background, whatever. But back then it was all done by hand.
Yeah.
And so that was a good lesson to just know that you got to think bigger than the obvious.
Today, we talk about our why, like why do we come to work every day, as being we just love the thrill of solving business problems.
Yeah.
And it's the word thrill that I really hone in on, because we've all been in those rooms where the energy lifts and the clients feel how excited you are. And that's why you do it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's why the other agencies don't. That's why they don't work. They don't think about that client in the way that we think about them.
Yeah. Yeah. If you can present an idea and get somebody emotional about that idea,
Exactly.
that's when you got them.
Yep. And I was so emotional that, as soon as I felt the client picking up on my excitement, I knew I had him, man. I knew I had that dude. But if you don't, then you're having a bad day.
Yeah.
It's just a bad day. I don't like having bad days.
But you're right. There's nothing more exciting than getting a client excited about the work, because you worked your butt off for a week, 2 weeks, longer, and get in there and present it. And if the energy's there and they get excited, you're on top of the world.
Oh, yeah. There's nothing like it. There's nothing like it.
Well, I'm excited for you to meet our staff today. Jim, I have to share with you on a personal level. I was sitting next to you at lunch today, looking across the table. I've worked at this company 22 years, nowhere close to where Chris has put it. But to be able to sit with the founder of the organization that has not only built my career, but has built so much of my life, right? I said to you, my little girls are going to benefit from the legacy that you started. And you said to me, you're very proud to see what we've been able to build. So just talk to me about sort of what this moment means to you, to be able to come back here and experience all that you started.
It's hard. Again, I'm emotional about it. It's, I never thought it would happen. I was so proud of what Lynn and I were able to build, and the quality of the people that we had in our family. And it was family. We did things for We had golf outings for our staff. Oh my God, that's the first time we ever created logos on the shirts and stuff. And everybody had golf shirts on, and I was amazed to see what was done with this company.
It's very important to me to live out the dreams of my predecessors. So what advice do you have for Tim and I and for Chris as we try to continue to carry this company forward?
That's an impossible question to answer. It really is. We're generations apart. I had different motivations to build a business to the point where I built it. I was motivated in a different way than you are. The times now are so different than they were back when I started, and even when I sold it. The times are so different. I mentioned what Abby said about AI, and I don't know a lot about AI. I was the first one in town to wear a pager, man. I was high tech. I had a pager in my pocket. I didn't have a cell phone to call the clients that called me, but I had a pager that told me, call Keith right away. He wants to see you right away. Now it's so easy. Everything is different now. But anyway, she wrote a little splurb here in Semantics about AI and how you've told your clients that you got to experience, you got to work with it every day. Well, for me, it was the internet. There was no internet when I started this business. The word internet didn't even exist. And we approached it the same way she told us to. We told our clients, a client would come to us and say, so what's this internet thing? How are we going to benefit from it? And it was so fun. We approached it the same way she told you guys to approach it with AI. I don't understand what it can do, but just the time I've spent here in the last day, my God, I would be on top of it, wouldn't I?
You'd be excited. Yeah.
Oh my God.
So keep experimenting, keep trying,
Yeah.
pushing the envelope.
Yeah.
Just keep going. I want to share something with you. I was on a call yesterday and we were talking about agency positioning. What's your go-to-market message, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there was an agency that was talking about brain science, the way people make decisions. There was another agency that was talking about the experiences, all the touch points, right? But I said, what makes Samantle unique is the way we partner. If we can bottle up and sell the way we do relationship building and culture, it works every time. Do you agree with that?
I do, but I think it's the relationship that we have with the clients. It's a relationship that in all the other agencies I've worked in never existed. And it's what instilled in me during those days when I would ask a question to an account person that brought me a job to design, wasn't being answered. And once I went on my own in a very small little way, I was starting to ask those questions to that client that were never asked to them before. It was a totally different world back then. It was more mechanical. Now it's intellectual. It's all intellectual. I always like I said, I liked hiring smart people that were smarter than me. But now it's different. It's different. It's a very cerebral business now. And there are people out there who try to do it, but are not successful at it. They know all the buzzwords. It's about those. We used to have buzzwords.
Oh, for sure, we still do.
Yeah.
I think it is different. I mean, I think it's just the world we live in is much more complicated than it used to be. Back in the early days, I mean, a campaign would be a set of like business collateral printed, and maybe a print ad, maybe a TV spot.
Yeah.
That was about it. And now, I mean, the ways that we have to connect with people are so different. I mean, you think about all of those interactions that can happen over the internet, and the ways that we can touch them through social media, through online advertising, all of that, and still the traditional ways too. So it's And people said when all this technology was coming in, it's going to get simpler. It's going to make everything so much easier. And it's made it way, way more complicated. But we're able to touch people in ways that we never could have done in years past,
Yeah.
back in the day.
What advice do you have for maybe a young creative, that's going to meet you tonight for the first time and realize, oh my gosh, this is Jim Simantel, the legacy that he built? What would you say maybe to a young designer who was you?
Exercise your passion. It's like anything. When you get a job, if you're not excited about it, get the hell out of it. I did it a number of times. I just got bored with it, you got to have passion for what you're doing. You got to love it, and you got to. I couldn't even wait to get to work in the morning. I couldn't wait. That's why I got in at 5:30, 6 o'clock. Because there was so much exciting things happening that I had to be there. Well, any young person's got to understand that. They need to understand what having passion for something does for your future. It drives everything, at least in my world.
Well, I thank you for saying that, because I believe we have built this business on the passions of other people, and we're going to continue to do that. So thank you so much for this place. And I call it my home, and I'm going to be here for a very long time. But thank you for what you built for us and for coming back and sharing your story.
Thank you, Jim. I know I said this at the beginning of the meeting, but I sincerely mean it. None of us would be here without you. You're an inspiring person. You had a personality bigger than this room, and you taught me everything that I know, and it's just been a joy.
Thank you for what you built for us and for coming back and sharing your story.
Thank you, Jim.